The idea behind the chair is that it's a knowledge exchange chair. George Greene is our first environmental governance chair, and he's an excellent example of the expertise and the approach that we hope to bring to campus.
We've broken this seminar into two parts. Part one is looking at the question of public participation in environmental policy through a domestic lens. The second half of the discussion today is going to be about international environmental governance, particularly participation of stakeholders in international processes.
I started my career as an environmental lawyer, and I moved into government almost 15 years ago because I believed then, and I still honestly believe now, that government can and should be a force for good on the environment and at bringing together the views, the economic interests of Canada, the community interests, the social interests, and the environmental interests, and that government can be an honest broker in that. George asked me to speak to the risks that we face both as government, as society, if we don't get public consultation right when it comes to environmental protection, and some of the benefits that we see when we do get it right. The risks that I see when we don't do consultation well, a couple of them are very obvious. If government is making decisions without the active input of civil society and industry, it risks making the wrong policy choices. It's acting on incomplete information, both technical and of interest, and we risk having badly formulated policy. We also do something else that is a little more subtle. We end up favoring strict regulation over more creative programs and tools that can manage the environment through kind of a variety of partnerships and a variety of mechanisms, because what government can do most easily on its own is put in place laws and regulations. The other thing we risk if we don't do public consultation well, and to be honest, I've actually seen this more than I've seen poorly constructed policy, we just don't make policy decisions. And the last thing that I see happening, the last risk if you don't consult well, is you can create policy or programs, but you're lacking the stakeholder base that is necessary to implement them. There have been processes we've used, and I think the best example is when Canada regulated the level of pollution in fuels, the level of sulfur in fuels. We used an extensive multi-stakeholder process. We had all of the relevant stakeholders around the table. They agreed to a type of economic analysis, a type of competitiveness analysis, and a type of health benefits analysis that would be done, and they agreed to be bound by the outcome of that. But by the end of the process, because we let it unfold and we let those constituents steer it, nobody was able to walk away at the end.
A university that's so kind of actively engaged in the community and in political solutions around this. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I think there's great potential with the history that I know George has in this field. The central question here is, how do we govern better for a better society, and why is it that this engagement with government is starting to fail? And if that's the case, then how do you engage with others to try and rebuild that those changes and make them work for everyone? You've got increasingly complex problems that don't just land in the environmental agencies, but they're in the social agencies, they're in the Aboriginal affairs agencies, they're in the development agencies, they're in the environment agencies, and often governments don't work well inside, and so they can't come up with some of those solutions. I see that the speed of business and the speed of change in the environment is so rapid these days, and the policy environment is so slow. We just can't rely on governments to solve our problems for us anymore. If everybody's displeased with the policy, then we must have done a good job. And that's a truism, and it's completely unacceptable in the current environment. There's far too much risk, there's far too much impact. We're seeing species go extinct, we're seeing communities suffer from levels of impoverishment that is just beyond shameful. We're seeing good companies fail and bad companies succeed. This is not the society that we can afford to live in, and it's got to move faster. And so, as an activist, I'm prepared to do anything necessary that is within the law to make that change happen. And so, partly it's what does governance look like in this series of sort of failed connections and urgent needs. We've been driven to work in markets to force companies to come to the table because governments and laws aren't willing or able to do it. And we've often also kind of brought companies to the table jointly to ask government for the change that we think could work for both progressive companies, NGOs, and communities.
To raise the bar on environmental performance, and I would argue in part because of the lack of government direction on that and the opportunity being seized by companies to try and demonstrate that they can improve their environmental performance.
Said that, let me just give some reflections here on this really important area of focus that George is leading for the school, because I think governance, quite simply, and the trends and opportunities for innovation around governance are at the heart of many of our environmental challenges. I graduated from Guelph in 1980 in marine biology, but the environmental problems of the day back then seemed quite simple. There was a clear line of sight between cause and effect, acid rain being one of the examples. The science of acid rain was quite understood, and thanks to Dr. Schindler and others, we knew what the point sources were as well. And there were off-the-shelf technologies for scrubbing SO2 from stacks that with government regulation, we were able to put that forward and simply clean up emissions point sources. But as you look at today's problems, like climate change being almost the extreme example, these current environment issues or issues with environmental consequences don't honor boundaries, whether it's between the economy, society and our lifestyle choices, or environmental consequences. And these are systems problems, in other words, where the effects might be known, but the causes and the solutions have to be looked at broadly. And in that regard, what's really then critical is the way in which you bring the diverse expertise and interests together to understand these systems problems. At this point in time, when complexity is higher, the need for convening is greater. It appears to me, certainly, and maybe it's because I work in the energy and environment space, that we have more polarization than we've ever had. We're seeing a real behavioral gap towards polarization, siloed engagement of parties, and very little discourse, very little effort to bring our best collective thinking forward to deal with these big problems. And so, to put it simply, the current status quo to me is unacceptable.
The one last thing I wanted to say was, George asked about this question of accountability. We do want accountability for public debate and dialogue, and I think that the NGOs are accountable for participating in that, and participating that in good faith, not misusing information, not misrepresenting facts, but to honestly speak our opinions and work with anybody who also shares those values.
I would just add one other qualifier. When we think of the roles that different actors play, like industry, one thing we're very conscious not to do is portray ourselves in any form as a proxy for the public interest. I mean, we have interests just like NGOs have interests, but government are the proxy for the public interest, and we really have to be cautious always of respecting that.
I think we're going to shift now to the second half of this forum, which is from the international perspective.
I suppose the question really comes down to, is the influence really substantial or not? And as I said, I think that's a lot less apparent. Stakeholders and civil society have been calling for a formal process, and I think what they've gotten is a lot of formality. And the formality has led to sort of just being a part of the system.
In the fields I work in, it has been reduced. There's been less active stakeholder engagement than formerly. The political protectionism by national governments. Governments are unwilling to give up sovereignty or authority to some higher authority or a broader agreement. They're concerned at protecting what they see as national interests. Sometimes the national interest is a special interest within their country that for some reason they've chosen to protect.
I think we have to be very careful about not thinking The same solutions that worked in the past will see us through these problems in the future. I think we'll need a different sort of process and a different sort of set of tools that acknowledge the system's complexity of these issues and the level to which solving these issues is integrated into every aspect of the economy.
The key requirement for movement on these issues is public awareness and acceptance of what the issue is and what the strategies are available to deal with it. A transformation of public awareness of the issue.